Well, good afternoon, everybody. Hello, hello, hello. I will wait just a few minutes to give people an opportunity. I will get started in just a second. Welcome in. Got me using my my little fancy schmancy software. Finally got the hang of it. So again, welcome in, welcome in. So happy to see you guys. Haven't been live in a long time, but I always have something to say. I'm just trying to do a little bit better about going live and just talking to you guys because once I get on here, I actually enjoy it. But I think sometimes it can be a little challenging getting past, I guess, a little bit of the anxiety and all the other stuff that comes up when you get ready to hit that live button. So again, welcome in, welcome in. As you can see, the wounded, the adapted, and the funk. So come in. As you come in, make sure you say hello so that I know that you are there. Feel free to share this out, tag people in the comments, and let them know that we're about to do a little bit of group therapy. Yes, on this fine Saturday. Where are you guys up to today? It is Saturday. The weather is relatively nice. And so we're going to get started again in just a few minutes. As you can see, what we were talking about down at the bottom, we coming after your inner child today. And I think that it's going to be something that will be educational. I don't necessarily think this is going to be, one of those words where you walk away, preaching and shouting and all of those things. Like my goal today is really to just teach you, to provide you a little bit of education, but to also provide understanding. The Bible says that people perish for lack of knowledge. So my goal today is just to provide you a little bit of knowledge. Most of you know that I am a licensed mental health counselor. I'm also a board certified clinician, and I have been in the mental health field for over 20 years. It sounds like a long time, but literally, mental health has been all I've known most of my life. Like, I don't think I've really had any jobs once I became an adult that were outside of mental health. So I feel that I'm qualified to be able to talk about this because of my experience with working with different groups of people. Early in my career, I worked with children who had behavioral and emotional problems. And then I worked with parents who were in the process of losing their children to the system because they had substance use disorders. I've worked in the prison system. That was probably one of my favorite jobs, believe it or not. And then for the last 7, almost 8 years, I work with veterans, also active duty, their families. And so the bulk of my work has been dealing with trauma. So that is going to be the meat of what we're going to be discussing today. But a lot of times when we think about trauma, we often think about being wounded as an adult, the trauma that affects us as an adult. However, that does have relevance, but I think sometimes we discount the wounds that we encounter as and again, just as to exactly how being wounded as a child shows up in the adult life, shows up when we're unable to form relationship. It shows up when we have difficulty maintaining jobs. It shows up in so many different ways. But like I said, a lot of times those ways are oftentimes discounted because we focus more on that adult trauma. And we're going to get to that too. But again, at the bottom, you can see what we're talking about today: healing the inner child, through the wounded child, the adaptive child, and the functional adult. If you are watching, please put something in the comments so that I know that you're there. Also, if you're watching, let me know if you can hear me and see me okay. I would hate to be knee deep in this good discussion and you're like, oh, we can't hear you. So if you're watching, thumbs that you can hear me, and also that you see me okay. And if you know somebody that might could benefit from joining our group therapy session, tag them in the comments. Feel free to share this on your page. Man, listen, this is some good information. And a lot of times too, I found that this is not information that you're not going to hear this on a Sunday morning, right? This isn't information that is typically taught in church. And it's just because of the different skill sets, and the purpose of church is typically for salvation. And so God has really been dealing with me a lot more about sharing the knowledge that I do have on these platforms that I built and don't use. So here we are. All right, guys. So we are going to get started. All right. So one of the first things that we need to understand is that we're talking about healing the inner child. I am going through this. I do have the ability to see comments. If you have a question, please drop it in the comments. Like, I want this to be like a back and forth, experience. If you are watching, you can ask me a question. If you need clarity on something that I say, let me know. I will be more than happy to repeat myself or give you a better explanation, because I want to make sure you get it. This is one of those discussions that it's going to pull on your intellect. It's going to pull on your ability to hear with an open mind. Yes, I said hear with your mind, because you're going to have to process it. It's a lot of information. It's probably stuff that you've never heard before. Or if you have heard it before, maybe it hasn't been explained quite like this. So I want to make sure that you're getting it. And so again, if I say something and you're not real clear, or if it doesn't make sense, or if you have a question about what I'm saying, by all right. So again, healing. And so when we think about the wounded child, a lot of times we think about those experiences that happened when we were little. The wounded child was typically hurt by abuse or neglect. This person, the wounded child, this person still exists within us, right? That's why we talk about inner healing. But inner healing sometimes goes a lot deeper than what we think is just on the surface level. Inner healing sometimes means you have to dig through all of those layers and have the ability to heal the inner child. So that child is typically hurt by abuse or neglect. They typically happen when they are very young, when they're vulnerable, often pre-verbal part of the psyche. So that's a part of the psyche before you even have language to formulate what that was occurring. This part of the psyche lives in the past. This part of your psyche, your intellect, your mind, it lives as. It is often overwhelmed, but at the same time, it longs for connections. Much trauma work focuses on the wounded child, right? And so, again, when we're talking about healing the wounded child, that inner child, we have to also remember that this is trauma. Typically, a person that has a wounded inner child is because trauma happened in some form. But one thing that we have to keep in mind is that it's not usually the wounded child that causes dysfunction in relationships. So let's put a pin right there and let's talk about the different stages of psychological development. So Erik Erikson was a well-known psychologist like during the 1960s. And so he came up with these 8 stages of development, because through depending on where that inner child was initially hurt, that may determine why you present in the way that you do, or maybe it'll give you a better understanding as to why others present in the way that they do. Okay, make sure you're following me. So Erikson maintained that personality develops in a predetermined order through 8 stages of psychosocial development, from infancy to adulthood. Each stage, the person experiences a psychosocial crisis, which could have a positive or negative outcome for personality development. So you may not have even known that our personalities are typically developed. And as we move through, we're going to talk about the different personality types and why they're developed. So for Erikson, he said that these crises are psychosocial in nature. So the psycho is the mental part, but the social is also the outward part. The psycho is mental, internal, but the social is external. So you have internal and external forces that help shape our personality. Did you hear me? We have internal, our psycho, our psyche, factors that affect our personality, right? And then the external factors are those social factors that help shape our personality. He says that because they are psychosocial in nature, that it depends on that person's needs being met, conflicting with the needs of society. According to this theory, successful completion of each stage results in a healthy personality. Successful completion of each healthy personality, but consequently, if these stages are not acquired, then the characteristic strengths which the ego can use to resolve, they result in crisis, right? Identity crisis. Failure to successfully complete a stage can result in a reduced ability to complete further stages and therefore a more unhealthy personality and sense of self. These stages, however, can be resolved later, but we're talking about what happens in that moment. So, one of the first stages that we need to talk about is trust versus mistrust. Let me just see if I can see my bar. I'm using all these screens so I can see. Trust versus mistrust. So, this is the first stage in Erik Erikson's theory of psychosocial development. This stage begins at birth and continues to approximately 18 months. During this stage, the infant is in which they live towards their primary for stability and consistency. So even at a very young age, babies are understanding their world, right? And the social that surround them. So they are learning stability and consistency. If the care the infant receives is consistent, predictable, and reliable, they will develop a sense of trust, which will carry them to other relationships, and they will be able to feel secure when threatened. If the needs are not consistently met, then they form mistrust, suspicion, and even anxiety. If the care has been inconsistent, unpredictable, and unreliable, then it may a sense of situation the infant in the world around these two influencers. So it's at this very early stage. Typically at this stage, face neglect, right? And so if this infant maybe isn't being fed on time, maybe they're not being cared for, they learn at a very early age that I can't trust the world around me. They learn very early on that I can't trust people. So sometimes when we become now adults and we lack the ability to trust others, sometimes that happened before we even have a memory of it. Because I don't remember being like a newborn, right? I don't remember being 18 months. You just don't have a memory of that. But the thing about the way that we are wired, although your mind might not remember, the emotions remember. The body keeps score. Treated as an infant, you have physical memory of that, but emotionally there's a memory, there's an imprint because it's how we are wired, right? So there's something that happens underneath the surface that now restructures your view of the world. You don't trust people because you were injured at this trust versus mistrust stage. Stage number 2, autonomy versus shame and doubt. Autonomy versus shame and doubt is the second stage of Erik Erikson's stage of psychosocial development. This stage occurs between the age of 18 months to approximately 3 years old. And in this stage, Erickson felt that the child focused on development as a sense of personal control over physical skills. Success in this stage will lead to virtue of will, right? Of the mind. So he's saying that the will. In this stage, the child is encouraged for their own independence, become more confident, they become secure in their own ability to survive in the world. If the child is criticized, overly controlled, or not given the opportunity to assert themselves, they begin to feel inadequate in their ability to survive and may then become overly dependent on others. They begin to feel inadequate in their ability to survive and may then begin to become overly dependent on others. What are you thinking of when I said that? Come on, class. What are you thinking of? That's where codependency stages of psychosocial development. At this stage where I am talking about the ability to be independent, and they don't have that because I was criticized, I was ridiculed. All of these things help shape me into a person that is now overly dependent on others, called codependency. And we see that a lot in relationships. People become so codependent on others. And when I say relationships, not just intimate relationships, sometimes you can see codependency in your friendships, right? You got that one friend that's super clingy. It's kind of weird, but it's codependent. But it was because at a developmental stage, they were wounded. They also lack self-esteem and feel a sense of shame, and they have doubt in their abilities, right? So they don't feel that they can do anything or get anything right. The third stage is initiative versus guilt. Initiative versus guilt is the third stage and is psychosocial development. During this stage, children assert themselves more frequently through directing play and other social interaction. And so at this stage, they're learning how to interact socially with others. Too much guilt can make the child slow to interact with others and may inhibit their creativity. Some guilt is, of course, necessary. Otherwise, the child will not know how to exercise self control or have a conscience. A healthy balance between initiative and guilt is important. Success in this stage will lead to virtue of purpose. So, this is where I'm learning about purpose, initiative versus guilt. However, if I don't develop or if I'm wounded at this stage, now I have a sense of guilt, right? And so it's vital that I make progress in this stage so that I can now understand and be able to, as an adult, walk into purpose. The next stage is industry versus inferiority. In this stage, oh, and the ages of this stage is 5 and 12. So we're talking about post-toddler to pre-adolescence, right? If children are encouraged and reinforced for their initiative, so initiative, having the initiative to do something. So that means they're doing things without being told. They begin to feel industrious, which means they feel competent and feel confident in their ability to achieve goals. If this initiative is not encouraged, if it is restricted by parents or teachers, then the child begins to feel inferior, doubting his or her own abilities, and therefore may not reach his own potential. So that's another reason why when a child reaches a certain age, because once they get to age 5, they're going to school. It is paramount that you have teachers that are speaking life into your children. It is paramount that you have people that are around your children that are building them and encouraging them and supporting them, because industry versus inferiority If they don't develop properly at this stage, it can cause them not to be able to trust in themselves. It can cause them to doubt in their own abilities. Again, going back to that idea of low self-esteem. But not only that, as a parent, from age 5 to age 12, it is your responsibility to speak life into your children, to build them, to make sure that they do have self confidence and a high level of self esteem. Because again, if they don't have that from the age of 5 to 12, then they develop a negative view of themselves. So you have the ability to restructure their personality even at a young age just by speaking life into them. The Bible says that life and death is in the power of the tongue. So what are you speaking over your children? What was spoken over you at a child that has now caused you to doubt yourself? Who told you you were stupid? Who told you that you weren't good enough? And now that thought is ingrained in your mind and you feel that you were inferior because of the lies that were told to you. It's during this stage that you thought that you were learned, that you didn't have the ability to do certain things, right? So that's why it's important to know these different stages of development. I'm building a foundation, right? We're going to get somewhere. If the child cannot develop the specific skills they feel society is demanding, then they may develop a sense of inferiority. So even at this stage, they're already comparing themselves to the world. They're seeing themselves through the lens of society. So, for example, that may look like, let's just say you have a family of athletes, like everybody's an athlete. Well, what about when you have this one child that's not athletic? Maybe they have no interest in being an athlete. So, as a parent, if you're not forcing them to be like everybody else and they're not standing up to that metric that you said, they feel inferior. Or again, maybe that's a situation that was done to you. Maybe somebody expected you to be something that was not natural for you. And because you didn't rise to the standard that they determined that you should be at, it ingrained this inferiority complex, right? You always see yourself through the lens of I'm less than or I'm not good enough. Stage number 5, identity versus role confusion. This is where it gets real good. So Erickson claims that the adolescent may feel uncomfortable about their body for a while because at this age, this is about 18. So this is where kids are starting to want to fit in socially. They become more aware of their body image. You know, they start thinking that I'm fat or I'm too skinny. They start thinking that I'm ugly or maybe I'm not. You know, they become more aware of their personal appearance, but they also become more aware of how others view them. That's why you hear such a plague, and it is a plague, where you have teens, you know, really starting at about the age of 12, they commit suicide because they're being bullied. Well, why is that? It's this identity versus role confusion because they are trying to accept their identity, but they're being bullied because they don't fit the role that people feel that they should fit in, right? And so it beats them down so bad that they feel that they have no existence being here. Identity on the basis of even when there may be ideological differences. In response to role confusion, there's also what's termed identity crisis. An adolescent may begin to experiment with different lifestyles. So at this stage, it's typically where you see adolescents, you know, wanting to come out. You know, they're confused about their sexuality. They begin to be confused about, you know, whether they want to be a boy or whether they want to be a girl. It's the identity versus role confusion. But even in that, a lot of times when you have teens who now become confused about their sexual orientation or even their sexual identity, a lot of times you can trace that back to that child being wounded at even an earlier stage, right? Typically, when you see teens or adolescents acting out sexually or even confused in that manner, sometimes it's because they were traumatized. They were sexually assaulted, they were abused, something happened typically that has now caused them to be confused. And of course, it's a trick of the enemy because if they were sexually abused or violated at an early age, it opens a spiritual door. And so now as they grow and they develop, it creates this, I'm not sure who I am, and they're confused. Does that, all of that make sense? Again, if you have questions about anything that I'm talking about, those of you that are just joining, drop a line in the chat. Let me know if you need me to explain something. Just let me know. And so Erickson has 8 stages, but we only talked about the 5 that dealt with from birth to pre-adulthood. The other stages that he has is intimacy versus isolation, generativity versus stagnation, ego integrity versus necessarily relevant, more so to life aging. About, and so we did all of that psychological stages of development. It's about how when a child is wounded during these stages, a lot of times they stay stuck. So if a child is wounded at a stage where there is industry versus inferiority, that adult self always struggles with feeling that they're good enough. And a lot of times that's where different complexes are formed. And I just lost the name of the one that I was thinking about. It'll come back to me in a minute. But it's where different complexes are formed regarding how we view ourselves. All right, so the next one is the adaptive child. So we talked a little bit about the wounded child. Now let's talk about the adaptive child. This is the one that wreaks havoc in your relationships. A lot of times, the one that causes issues, it's the adaptive child. And why is that? Glad you asked. The adaptive child developed to protect the wounded child. So we're talking about the 3 types of your psyche, right? So you have the wounded child. That's the one that's on the inner. So because I was wounded so much as a child, now I have to create this persona that helps me now protect the wounded child. It's called the adaptive child. So you have the wounded child, the one that was wounded, and the adaptive child rises up to now protect what has happened or is happening to the wounded child. It is a later developing child part that also lives in the past and cares only for, but its whole it only cares about self-protection, willing and or is unable to learn new skills. So the first thing that I thought about when I read that is you have these people where you see them maybe behaving in ways that we don't feel are appropriate as an adult. And a lot of times we tell these individuals, why won't you grow up? Why won't you grow up? Why won't you do this? Because they're behaving in a way that on the outside looking in, we deal is inappropriate for somebody that has reached this age. You're acting like a child. They are. And the reason that they're acting like a child is because they feel that when they are triggered, that the wounded child is now exposed and vulnerable. So the adaptive child rises up to protect them. But it still lives in the past. They're having a present occurrence, but it takes the past. It is unwilling and or is unable to learn skills. It is a child's version of an adult which developed in reaction to and resistance to against its wounds. So the adaptive child rises up not only to protect the wounded child, but it also shows a force to make sure that it's not wounded again. So how that looks is a person that is always defensive. Like you just want to have a conversation and boom, they're defensive. It is because they've learned that their response to any sort of uncomfortable emotion, any uncomfortable situation, any perceived threat is that my adaptive child now rises up because I have to protect that inner child. But you on the outside looking in don't know that's what they're doing. You feel that they have this behavior. It seems having an inability to protect that wounded child. And I just got about my connection. So if my connection is going in and out, guys, let me know. and come in and speak to me. I see some of y'all watching, but y'all ain't communicating. I need y'all to talk to me. So let me know if you guys are there. This is good. If it's helping you, if you have a comment, let me know. But again, just said that my stream was acting silly. So if you're losing me, let me know. I need y'all to help me. All right, so let's scroll down a little bit. So we're talking about the adaptive child. If a child's version of an adult which developed in reaction to and a resistance to its wounds, it is also learned to model or imitate the dysfunctional behavior of the parent. Did you hear me? The adaptive child, because we're learning. It says that the adaptive child is a learned behavior. It has learned to imitate or model the dysfunctional behavior of the parent they were resisting or reacting against. So that's why a lot of times when you have a family that has a history of dysfunction, right? Why do you think that they all are dysfunctional? Right? You may have grandparents who are dysfunctional and they pass that dysfunctional behavior down to a set of parents. Those parents, if they didn't go back and heal that inner wounded child, they pass those same dysfunctional behaviors down to their children. Well, that's because the adaptive child's response to that dysfunction is to mimic it. It's like looking in a mirror. And so that's why, too, when you come to the realization that you have healthy, you need to go to. That's why therapy can be so important, because it helps you identify the behaviors that aren't healthy, but it also helps you reframe and restructure your thought processes so that you behave differently. Because our behavior starts in our mind. We think a thing, then we perform it outwardly, right? So it's cognitive and it's behavioral. There's a whole line of therapy that's called cognitive behavioral therapy. Because in order for behavior to be changed, we got to change your thoughts first. So a man thinketh in his heart, so is he, right? In the Bible, the mind and the heart is oftentimes interchanged. So if I think a certain way, or even if I believe that the way that I'm reacting or responding to different situations is normal, then I'm going to continue it not knowing that it's dysfunction. And then if I don't change or stop the pattern of dysfunctional behavior, now I pass that down to my children. Why do you think you see children who are really young? You can learn a lot about household by just watching them. If they're mean, if they call names, if they, only know how to get attention by yelling or having tantrums. And don't get me wrong, I know to a certain degree, some of that is normal, right? Because I've had children. I have children and they were young at one time and they did those behaviors. But a lot of times they did those behaviors because they learned them watching other kids, not because it was allowed at home. But then when they came home, I let them know, that's dysfunction. We don't do that here. But a lot of times behavior is learned, but we have to be willing to step back and look in the mirror and understand that the way that I'm resolving conflict, the way that I'm interacting with the world, I'm looking through the lens of dysfunction. So sometimes you have to take the glasses off, behave differently. It's changed. Let's talk about personality disorders. So typically when personality disorders are formed, it's out of the adaptive child. So the wounded child is formed out of abuse, neglect, trauma, you name it. That creates a child that is wounded. In response to the wounded child, the adaptive child now rises up, and its function is to protect the wounded child, right? Wounded child is injured. Adaptive child rises up to protect. What gets tricky is that when this adaptive child now rises up, usually it takes on the form of a different personality. That's where you have personality disorders develop. Person 9 times out of 10 that have personality disorders, they were traumatized as children. And it's the adaptive child that has now created like almost a completely different identity as a way to protect itself and as a way to deal with the trauma. So the brain is good for what it's good for. The brain is so intricate. It does its job really, really well. It does its job so well that a lot of times when a person is in the middle of trauma, the brain has these protective mechanisms that now create somewhat of a protective layer. Sometimes people don't even remember it, but in that again forms this new identity to allow the person to be able to withstand the trauma. Personality disorders. So let's talk about the different types of personality disorders. Again, if you're watching in the comments, I want this to be an interactive group therapy experience. If you have questions, if you have comments, if there's something that you would like me to talk about a little bit more as I'm going through this, definitely let me know. Again, my goal today is just to give you some education. This isn't, information that is often, shared across the pulpit on Sunday morning, which is fine. Typically this is information that you would either learn through going through therapy. You can sometimes find this stuff on YouTube. But this has been coming up so much in the therapy that I've been doing with people lately. I knew that it was information that the body needed, right? This is information that you just need to be able to understand not only yourself, but hopefully this will be information that can also help you understand your interaction with others. So, the child, active child rises in an effort to protect the wounded child. Now let's talk about how personalities develop as a result of this adaptive child rising up to protect. So personality disorders, what are they? You've heard about them, but do you know what they are? They are a deeply ingrained pattern of behavior of a specific kind that deviates markedly from the norms of generally accepted behaviors, typically apparent by the time of adolescence, right? Because we're talking about the wounded child, person rises up. So typically, when people have personality disorders, it starts to show in adolescence. And it causes long-term difficulty in personal relationships or in functions to society. So there's different clusters of personality disorders. There's cluster A, cluster B, and cluster C. So we're going to talk about all the different clusters and we're going to break down some of the different personality disorders that are embedded within each cluster. Like I said, if there's any one that I go over and you would like me to explain more, or if you have a question, y'all talk to me. I feel like I'm doing this thing solo and I see people watching. Y'all not being obedient. You won't say, hey, you won't give me a thumbs up, but that's all right. When I log out and this is over, I'm going to know who it is and I'm going to be in your inbox asking why you didn't engage with me. All right. So cluster A, personality disorders. This is eccentric thinking. Cluster A, personality disorders, eccentric thinking. Cluster A, personality disorders involve eccentric or odd ways of thinking. This group of personality disorders include paranoid personality type, schizoid personality, simple personality, paranoid personality, and these disorders involve thinking that everyone is out to get you. Are y'all hearing me? You know somebody. You know somebody who always thinks everybody's out to get them. The world is against me. You are against me. The job is against me. Like God is against me. Everybody is against them. So it's eccentric. But what a person perceives is their reality. So if they perceive that this is their existence, then they believe it, right? So again, these personalities think that everyone is out to get them. Schizoid personality disorder is characterized by limited emotional expression and social detachment. Schizotypal personality disorder person is flash of light that no one else can see. So you be thinking, well, what is schizophrenia? schizophrenia is not necessarily a personality disorder. Schizophrenia has to do more so with the person believing and thinking things that just aren't true. Schizophrenia can also involve different personality types. So schizophrenia would be more so of a big umbrella in which some of these other things would fall up under. So the other thing about cluster A personality disorders, they almost always are related in some way to distorted thinking. They almost and always in some way have distorted thinking. So again, if you're thinking about your interactions with others, have you ever interacted with somebody and just the way that they saw a situation, you knew that it was distorted, right? It was distorted. The way that they saw things was distorted. Well, isn't sin somewhat the same way? It's a distortion of the truth. So why would that be any different? This would be where the enemy would definitely move in and cause somebody to have a distortion of truth. But they believe it. They believe that what they're seeing, believing, thinking, experiencing is their truth. Again, perception is reality. And so we're talking about cluster A personalities, and that involves around eccentric thinking. Cluster B personalities. So these are moods and emotions. Cluster A have to do with our thoughts. Cluster B have to do with our moods and our emotions. Cluster B personality disorders are often characterized by emotional, dramatic, or erratic behaviors. Cluster B, we're talking about personality disorders. And again, these personality disorders arise as a way to protect the wounded child, right? Typically, personality disorders develop in early adolescence because it's a way to protect that inner child that has been wounded. This group of personality disorders includes antisocial personality disorder. And let me just say something really quick. A lot of times when people hear antisocial, they think that this is a person that doesn't like society. That's not necessarily true. A person that has antisocial personality disorder, they go against societal norms. A child that has oppositional defiant disorder can oftentimes grow into an adult that now has antisocial personality disorder. So they oppose authority. They oppose any social norms, right? They're the ones that no matter what you tell them is right, they're not going to do it. A lot of these radical left-wing groups that you see, a lot of them probably have antisocial personality disorder. So it's not that they're opposed to socializing. They don't believe that they should have to adhere to whatever social norms are put in place. Does that make sense? They don't adhere to social norms. So it's not antisocial in regards to interacting, it's antisocial in regards to the social norms that a society has in place. Then you have borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder. Oh, and here's y'all favorite, narcissistic personality disorder. Somebody just shouted. I know you did, but you won't put that in the comments. Let me double check this chat before I get upset with y'all because y'all ain't talking to me. No, y'all ain't chat. I'm gonna need y'all to talk to me. Let me see. Okay. Let's put it on. So now to come across the screen when you're ready to talk. All right. So we're talking about personality disorder, the form of moods and emotions. So you may be asking yourself, how is narcissistic personality disorder a way that affects a person's mood or their emotions? Well, let's think about a narcissist, right? A person that has narcissistic personality disorder, they gaslight. Everything that they do is a direct attack on the person that they're attacking, their mood and their emotions. So it may not necessarily be that it affects them directly, but their goal is to somewhat disrupt the moods and the emotions of those that are around them. So we're going to go through it just a little bit. So a person with borderline, let me back up. So those diagnosed with antisocial personality often behave without regard to the needs. A person with antisocial personality disorder often behave without regard to the needs of others. So this person is very selfish. Everything that they do is about them. Again, going back to why they don't adhere to the social norms, they feel that it doesn't apply to them. So let's talk about borderline personality disorder. It causes the person to experience mood changes that affect their ability to continue with everyday life. So what does that look like? People with borderline personality disorder, they're often suicidal. But the thing is, they don't want to die. They use that as a way to manipulate you into feeling sorry for them. They use it as a way to manipulate those around them, to give them attention, to cater to the wounded child. Because if you think the hopefully you'll have an aha moment and it'll make sense to you. So we're talking borderline personality. They're usually very dramatic. They're usually the type of person that, they're just have these really extreme highs, really extreme lows. Almost sounds like a person that is bipolar, but this is about a personality type, not necessarily an instability of their emotions. Next, we have histrionic. Personality disorder causes the person to feel uncomfortable if they are not the center of attention. Ooh, I know y'all know somebody like that. Histrionic personality disorder. They are uncomfortable if they are not the center of attention. People with narcissistic personality disorder, they believe, let me get my mouse back over. Cluster B personality struggle over strong actions and emotions. So a person with narcissistic personality disorder, they have a superiority complex. Like they believe that they're better than, they believe that they have a higher importance. A lot of times they have this grandiose way of thinking, and grandiose is just another term for being like very grand, right? But it's not in proportion to who they really are. They perceive themselves as a god, lowercase g, and they think that everybody else should worship the ground that they walk on. This shows up a lot of times in relationships. The dangerous thing about a person that has narcissistic personality disorder is that you don't know it on the front end. A lot of times they do very well with covering that emotion. They're almost like they create this and they lure you in. Passionate, like they're all the things that you think they want. But the moment that they feel that their place in your life no longer is that of superiority, or that their place in your life no longer is of the highest esteem, that you typically see them change. And they manipulate your emotions to place them back on a pedestal. So you have to be really, really careful about narcissistic personality disorder. The last cluster of personality disorders is those that show up in a form of fear and anxiety. So this is called cluster C. Cluster C personality disorders involve fearful thinking. This group includes avoidant personality disorders, dependent personality disorder, and obsessive uh, compulsive personality disorder. Those who suffer from avoidant personality disorder often have low self-esteem and low self-confidence. And we talked about that when we talked about Erik Erikson's psychosocial stages of development. How in that trust versus mistrust stage, if I don't learn how to trust those around me, it can create anxiety. So does it make sense how, if I am not properly developed as a child, as an adult, it can morph and shape my personality? So I didn't trust adults growing up because I was abused, neglected. So as an adult, I have this fear and anxiety about the world around me, right? So now I'm able to trust, but at the same time, it causes me to have low self-esteem and low self-confidence. So then we have dependent personality disorder. So this is called dependency. Depend on us for everything, right? codependent. This again shows up a lot of times in relationships. And then the last one is obsessive compulsive personality disorders. And it involves a heavy focus on rules, details, and orderliness. Cluster C personality disorders often stem from fear and anxiety. So we talked about the different personality types. So we discussed the wounded child, we discussed the adaptive child. So now let's fast forward to the functional adult. So the functional adult is that part of ourselves that is able to be rational. It's that part of ourselves that is able to make decisions. The, the So the first two, the child and the adaptive child, they live in the past, but they still live on the inside of us. That's why therapy can be so important, so that you can go back and heal that inner child, so that you can go back and heal the wounds of the wounded child, so that you can now move forward and be a functional adult. A lot of times as adults, when we don't address the wounds that have happened to us, when we don't address the trauma that happened when we were younger, we're not able to function as adults. We are dysfunctional. So if I am now a wounded child who didn't address my wounds, and I've now transitioned into adulthood, everything about me is dysfunctional because I never changed and moved into a functional adult. So that's why you have families that are rooted in dysfunction. And again, if you look down through the lineage, if you look down through the history, it's trauma that has been passed down from generation to generation. So the whole family is dysfunction because you have adults that never healed. So now you're telling me that here you are with your dysfunctional self, you're getting in a relationship with somebody else who is also dysfunctional, and you don't understand why the relationship won't work. I'm giving y'all free therapy today. I'm giving y'all therapy strategies. I want y'all to get this and understand why it is so important that you deal and that you heal from the inside out, because you have to be at some point a functional adult. So it is based in present times and understand perfection and give trauma and their impact on relationships. Flexible, and it can learn new skills. We cannot use communication and conflict management skills adequately while our body is triggered and reactive because our thinking brain is hijacked. I'm gonna say that again. We cannot use communication and conflict management skills adequately while our body is triggered and reactive because our thinking brain is hijacked. And so in the brain, you have the left brain and the right brain. The left brain is your logic, the right brain is your emotion. These result in reactions from our adaptive child parts, whose sole motive is dealt with my past. And also, let me say this too. Sometimes adult trauma, right? Adult trauma can also affect our ability to be a functioning adult, because trauma is trauma. The difference about being traumatized as a child is reality, and it also affects the lens through which we see the world. Sometimes when we are now traumatized as an adult, if we had a relatively good foundation, that foundation can be strong enough to lift us up out of the trauma that's occurred to us. And then we'll have the skills that we need to now move into being a functional adult. But why is it important to understand the communication and conflict management piece when we're talking about dealing with somebody who's wounded? Because you'll find yourself beating your head on the wall, trigger that you said. They were triggered by something that you unintentionally did that now triggered that inner child, right? So you have a wounded child that's already hurt. You may not know this, right? So the inner child hurt, we bury it deep down within the surface. The adaptive child rises up to protect the inner child. So maybe you said something that triggered them. So the inner child now feels that hurt. In response to that hurt, the adaptive child rises up, and now you think you're having a logical conversation with the adult that's standing in front of you, and you're not. Your entire conversation is with the adaptive child who is trying to protect the wounded child. Does that make sense? You are not even having a conversation at that point that is of you. It's response that you're now because the adaptive isn't to a trigger and they are reacting to what you've done as a way to protect. It is a defense mechanism. Defense mechanisms rise up to protect ourselves. And in that person's mind, what they're doing makes sense. Oh, you ain't gonna talk to me like that, or they shut down. So you can see it a couple of different ways. People can respond in a manner that is defensive, and that they argue back with you, they engage, like it can be an over response, or they just shut down. Like you think that it's just a decent conversation, and that adaptive child rises up and the entire person shuts down. And you don't know what happened. Well, it was something that triggered them. And their defense mechanism in that situation within way out, right? So they don't it to protect themselves and to keep you as far away as possible, because you in some way have hurt the inner child, and their job is to make sure that you don't hurt that inner child anymore. But on the outside looking in, it doesn't make sense. When we're triggered, our adaptive child parts literally feel and behave as if they are in a fight for survival, and they fight like immature kids. So let's talk about just for a second, what that looks like. So we're talking about when a person's adaptive child rises up, it is a fight or flight response, right? And so it's something that happens in the brain. So in the brain, let me go to my hand model of the brain so I can make it make sense to you. So in our brain, we have the left brain, to show you a hand model of the brain. So right here would be the brain stem, right? And then this will be our spinal cord. The other thing to keep in mind is that in our gut are neuroreceptors. You've often heard people say, I had a gut feeling. Well, what that means is that there was something happening within the gut, the neuroreceptors that send a transmission up to our brain. And it can also be, if you think about being able to discern, right? Like you can just feel, you can just sense that something isn't right. Well, you have neuroreceptors in your stomach that literally pick up on what's going on in your environment. That's why a lot of times that people deal with anxiety, people that deal with stress, it's in their gut. They now have digestive issues. It's in our stomach. So you have the brainstem, you have spinal cord, and all of that runs down to the gut. So right here would be considered the amygdala. This is our fear center. This is where our irrational thinking lies. It's where our emotion is. It's our fight, flight, freeze, collapse, where all of our big emotions are. This is where anger, fear, anxiety, and our survival is. This is the amygdala. And so we all need to feel safe. We all need to be able to form attachments, and we all need to have emotional regulation. So on top of that, this would be our prefrontal cortex. This is our thinking brain. This is where your left brain is centered. And the left brain is where you can be rational. It's where you think, you have body control. Relationships are formed. This is compassion. regulation, logic, consequence. This is language is. I want you to keep that in mind. Put a plug on that. The prefrontal cortex is the thinking brain. It's the left brain. This is where language is. This is where we have reasoning and control. It is considered the wise leader. So, if we're talking about what's going on within the brain, right? We have the left brain. So, if this is where logic is, this is where language is. And again, this is our emotional brain. This is our amygdala. So, it functions like this. So when I'm functioning and I'm going about life like I need to, when everything is working together, my neuroreceptors are sending the right transmitters, like everything is working. I'm but what is when I'm emotional response that sent to this right brain, my emotion. This is where the fear, the threat response system is activated. This is where fight or flight is activated. So something happens and I'm triggered. So now that prefrontal cortex, it starts to open up. So again, when I said we cannot use communication and conflict management skills adequately while we are being triggered, it's because I'm no longer logical. Emotions, the amygdala, logic and reason, prefrontal cortex, sits kind of like this. So as I become triggered, my prefrontal cortex, my logic no longer exists. So here you are trying to have a conversation with the person who's triggered. They're going to do one or two things. Have a panic response and they're going to fight, or maybe it's verbally, or they're going to flee. Sometimes that flight may look like they've shut down, but in essence, they flipped their lid, right? So now my right brain is fully exposed. The purpose of the left brain is to somewhat protect the emotions. But if I'm triggered, it's like somebody hits a button. Do you remember the old school Jack in the Box? So this person is going about their day and they're getting little things that happen. And as these little things that happening, their threat response system is being overloaded. And then maybe you come along and you say something and it's like, boom. And you're like, well, man, what did I do? It may be that that situation in essence had nothing to do with you. Last, so they flip their, now you're trying to talk to them, you're trying to reason with them, you're trying to make sense with them, and it's not going to happen. A person that has flipped their lid, a person that has panicked, they've lost the ability to be logical and to have reason. Can I give you another example? So it works well when it works well. Fight or flight was downloaded, it's a part of us for survival. So, have you ever seen those stories where, maybe it's like these superhuman things that happen, like say for example, somebody they get in a car accident and maybe the car ends up landing on top of them. You will have two or three people that will go in what seems humanly impossible. They lift this car up. That's adrenaline. It is a response. Can be good in a situation like adrenaline is flowing. I now have superhuman strength, and they can pick this car up because a part of them has panicked. But they panicked in a good way because they know that they need to respond. In a situation like that, you can't be logical. You can't walk up to the car and say, well, I wonder how many of us is it going to take to be able to lift this car up? I wonder what strategy we're going to use. So in that moment, adrenaline kicks in to override that logical piece. And now we're over into our right brain, but it gives us this superhuman strength. That's great. If somebody's in a car accident and I need to have a reaction, it's not so great. If now my adrenaline is pumping, I have this superhuman strength, and you said something that ticked me off. People can have these super extreme emotional responses, and in your mind it doesn't make sense, could that you've in some way threatened that unhealed inner child, and now the adaptive child has risen up to protect them, and now you see this dysfunctional adult responding? There is no logic. You can't talk to them. That's why you find yourselves walking in circles trying to have this conversation. There is no logic when a person has been triggered, when they've panicked. So now you're dealing with the amygdala, the right brain, which is all emotional. You can't talk to emotions. You can't talk to emotions. And then sometimes you have people who are so logical that they can't feel. They can't feel your emotions because they live here. Reason. Balance. But sure that you understand what happens in the brain of a person that has trauma, because it is a response reaction to the world around them. So let's talk a little bit about nature versus nurture. I hope this is helping somebody, just making sense of this. So nature versus nurture. We are all products of the interaction between nature, which is the world around us, and nurture, which is how we were raised. And sometimes it can be, how we were nurtured growing up. When our adaptive child parts don't feel safe, as happened in our past environment, which is the nurture, they react, resist. So, okay, let me back up. I had it backwards. So, I had it backwards. Sorry. When our parts don't feel safe, environment, I had it. So, nurture has to deal with your environment. They react and resist very predictable ways, which are based on our unique neurobiology. That's nature. So nature says that we are wired in certain ways by neurobiology, right? But it's a matter of both. Even though I have a certain wiring because of nature, that wiring, the way that it functions and the way that it exists, can be positive or negative depending on how I am nurtured. These predictable reactions are hardwired by evolutions, talking about the right brain, the amygdala, and the prefrontal cortex, which is that logical brain. It's innate. It is the fight, flight, freeze, submit, or cling survival behavior. So when we talk about how we respond, sometimes it's flight. And flight means that internally, flight may mean that I can't stay in one place long, right? And then let me just say this because it popped in my mind. When you see people that church hop, right? We know those people. They church hop. But a lot of times at the root of that, they'll tell you it's because of church hurt. But it may not even be, and we talk about this a lot of times, the church doesn't hurt you. Could it be that people in the church have hurt you? Sure. Hurt people. But at a deeper level of that, I would say that it's because the flight, the reason why they hop and go from place to place is because they're leaving uncomfortable situations, because of their own inner child that has been wounded. And an adult functional, something I've been triggered, maybe because somebody said something, maybe because somebody did something. The way that I now respond to that is flight. Well, I'll just leave. I'll just go to another church. That is a threat response. That is a defense mechanism because they've been triggered in some way. They're no longer logical. You can't talk to these people. When you try to ask them what happened, they can't tell you. They're in their emotions. They're in that right brain because they've been triggered. And you're not going to be able to get a logical reason from them as to why they're now in flight mode. The other response is freeze. They may not do anything. They're not really arguing. They're not in flight. They're just not doing anything. Sometimes we see that in life. We find people at different stages of life where they're frozen and I just don't what I'm supposed to. I just don't have purpose. It could be that it's a part of their inner child that is now manifesting. That inner child is now showing up in these different scenarios. And it's not that you don't necessarily know what you should be doing. It could be that because of the stress that you're currently dealing with has now activated that adaptive child to protect you, and now you're frozen. You think about if you ever like hear people tell you like what to do, if a dog is ever after you, what do they tell you? Don't run. Okay, I don't know about that. But that's what they tell you, right? If a dog is ever chasing you, you ever been chased by something, the first thing they tell you is don't run. Well, my threat response system don't work like that. I'm running, right? But it's the same idea. They feel that they are being threatened by something in their external social setting. So submit a good comes to God. But comes challenging and submission to God is that a lot of now have a relationship with God, that same functional adult, because we're unhealed and we're wounded, we struggle with forming a relationship with God. We struggle with submission. We struggle with adhering to rules and different regulations, things that we told that we should do because of our own unhealed areas. So again, it's important that you go on a journey to being open to just healing, inner healing, deliverance. Sometimes we need to walk through deliverance so that we can fully be set free. The other thing when it comes to survival is that's that codependent. We feel why people struggle with singleness. It's a clinging that they have learned that in order to succeed, in order to survive, my survival is now dependent on my relationship with others. And so they struggle with being alone. They struggle with those moments where it is just them and God. They don't like the way that feels because it stirs up rejection. It stirs up those feelings of being inferior. It stirs up all of these negative emotions that come up. And so now we cling to others, even if the relationship is unhealthy, even if the situation is unhealthy, even if the environment is toxic. So that's again why you see a lot of times, maybe more so with women than in men, you'll see women who will get into relationship people, they will get relationship just straight up, and then you step back, they've clung to that. Their whole survival is about being with somebody, even if that somebody is unhealthy, even if that somebody means them no good. And so it can be a struggle for people who doesn't understand why they subject themselves to that mistreatment and that behavior. Again, because it's not a logical response. Their survival is based off of their emotions, which again is that amygdala, that right brain, and you can't reason with them. They can't be logical because this is their left brain. And then people that have been repeatedly traumatized, it takes work to get them back into their logical brain. Everything that they do is out of emotion. Every response that they have is typically an emotional response because it's trauma. Trauma has caused them to not be logical. Everything is based off of the emotion. And so they look through the lens of that amygdala, which is the right brain. And so, again, just being able to understand what happens, in our mind when we go through different experiences, and why a lot of times people struggle and they subject themselves to dysfunction. And for many people, dysfunction becomes a way of comfort because it's familiar. It's what they know. It's a lot of times predictable. And so moving them out of that dysfunction can even be challenging because a world that has functionality to it, that has order, that has structure, is foreign. And they really, really struggle with that. So I'm going to do a real quick recap for anybody that may have just hopped on. Again, guys, if you have questions, so I can see who on. A quick recap, share, let somebody know that we talked today about healing the inner child, the wounded child, the adaptive child, and the functioning adult. So quick recap, we began by discussing what the wounded child is. And the wounded child is that part of ourselves that was hurt by abuse or neglect at a young age. And that part of ourselves lives in the past. As a response to being wounded as a child, the adaptive child now rises up as like the big brother, big sister. Its goal is to protect the wounded child. So you have the wounded child and the adaptive child, they still live within us. So that's why you have to sometimes in your therapy, in your trauma work, in your healing, you have to go back and heal the inner child. The other piece of that is that during the different stages that we develop, we talked about can determine how we grow adults. It affects our personality. Then we move right on into the different personality types. As a result of having a wounded child, we talked about cluster A personality types, which is the eccentric thinking. Then cluster B revolves around our personality disorders, moods, and emotions. Cluster C is fear and anxiety. And then we talked about how do we get to the functional adult. And the functional adult is that part of ourselves that we strive to come to. It's that part of ourselves that is able to function, in society, to be able to function in relationships, to be able to function as a whole. And so just being able to understand the different processes and what goes on in the brain, then we talked about the left brain, logical brain, and our reason, and our language, our right brain, you have the base of the spine and how our neuroreceptors in our gut send messages to our brain regarding our environment. And so again, today I just wanted to give you a little bit of the nerd, Holly. Y'all, I can talk about this all day. And just help you understand, a lot of times when we talk of being wounded, when we talk about, what it means to be healed, well, what happens psychologically? Because there's a part of us, we are spirit and we are also flesh. We talk about how our soul is our mind, our will, and our emotions. So being able to understand what happens spiritually, we get a lot of conversations, a lot of discussion. Typically in church, we talk about what happens spiritually, but there isn't much conversation happening about what our soul, our will, and our life, and we healed. Well, how do I know what healing looks like if I don't even know what happened to me psychologically? Sometimes we think that the personality that we have is our true personality, and it's not. It's the adaptive child that has risen up to protect ourselves. And then if you're able to get healed, you'll realize that's not really your personality, but it is a defense mechanism that was created in an effort to protect yourself. Oh, just really quickly, another personality that I didn't talk about was multiple personality disorder. That's another one that is really big that rises up. Halle Berry did a movie a couple of years ago. I think it's called Sam and I can't remember, but if you Google Halle Berry, she did a movie where she suffered from multiple personality disorder. But at the root of that was trauma. So if you really want to understand how are created way to protect that child, that is a great case study if you just want to understand. But yes, multiple personalities disorders is also something that rises up, or that's created from the adaptive child as a defense mechanism to protect the inner child. And a lot of times when people have multiple personality disorders, you have like maybe somebody who represents a mother figure. You'll have somebody who may represent a father figure. There may be another personality that represents, a different form of the child. And so people do suffer from that. But again, it's also important to keep in mind that's why deliverance can be so important. So, my goal is to give you a psychological understanding, but also kind of take you back to what we do with that. But again, sometimes through, so many different things that deal with the spirit, and it can close doors. But you walking through deliverance doesn't all the time erase the things that have been done to you. Yes, sometimes you can walk through deliverance and you have no memory of what happened. Praise God for that. But what happens when you walk through deliverance and the memory of your past still haunts you? What happens when you walk through deliverance and that inner child within you is unhealed? So it's important that you have an understanding of the psychological piece and be able to kind of merge the two, just so you can have your own understanding. I hope that this was helpful. Like I said, I came on to talk about this because I've had a couple of sessions this week, and a lot of the work has been with helping people understand what happens psychologically when they are wounded, as a child. And so I thought that this information for you, hopefully it was inspiring. Feel free to comment. I would love your feedback. This was good and you would like more teachings on just kind of the psychology of the human being, but also, with biblical perspective, let me know. I would be more than happy to come and do more teachings on this. Also, go check out my website. If you have not, please go check out my website, themultifacetedsoul.com. And also, if you haven't got my book, go order a book. It's great. It's also talking about healing. But that book is Women of the Well, A Single Woman's Journey to Wholeness. So in that book, it talks a lot about the soul, the mind, the will, and the emotions, but giving you biblical and scriptural perspectives on how do we heal the wounded soul. So I think I'm going to do a little bit more teaching on trauma and what it does to the soul. Also giving you understanding of soul wounds, and just being able to understand, what happens, to our soul when we are wounded. And so again, I hope that this was helpful. If you are just joining, I'm done. I've been on here for an hour and 22 minutes, but make sure you go back and catch it from the beginning. Send me comments. Let me know if this was helpful. And thank you for those of you who hopped on. If you're catching the replay, holler at me. Let me know that you watched this. And you guys were absolutely phenomenal. Until next time, enjoy the rest of your Saturday.